Hello and welcome to this webinar on Education at a Glance 2018 OECD Indicators. This webinar will present the report which provides the latest data on the state of education around the world and which this year has a new focus on equity in education. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, and you may send any questions you have to Eric Magnuson at eric.magnuson@oecd.org. That's Magnuson, MAGNUSSON @oecd.org, using the question answer function or via Twitter at hashtag OECD in caps ECAPDU skills. For your information as well, this webinar is being recorded and will be available from our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/user/educontact in the next few days. So I would now like to hand you over to Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills.
Yes, hello, and I'm privileged to be joined by Marie-Hélène Dumais, who's actually the principal author of the volume and will help me answer your questions. Let me turn to the main theme of this year's edition of Education at a Glance, which is how different factors of inequality actually interact and impact on people's life chances. Starting with the early years, when you look at children the age of older than 3, enrollment rates in many countries are now close to universal. But when we look at the youngest children, for whom education actually plays a very, very important role in leveling the playing field, we see that access is still very patchy. Here you see the enrollment rate of children under the age of 3, but we also see that inequalities are still significant. What I've done here is I've, by different colors, signaled enrollment rates for children with different levels of educational attainment of their mother. And you can see, for example, in virtually every country, if the mother has no tertiary level education, enrollment rates are significantly below those for educated parents or mothers. So it's not only that in many countries, many young children do not have access to high quality education and care, but it's also that that kind of access is amplified in the sense that those who need it most often get the least out of this. We then see those inequalities, translating into what schools cope with. Children coming from different social backgrounds, achieving different levels of, mathematics performance in this case. Basically, we have sort of created a parity index on this. Ideally, you'd want to be at number 1, which basically means when you look at the red cross, disadvantaged and privileged children achieve similar math results, but virtually every country is below that line. And in some countries, when you see 0.8, it basically means that those parity, that basically the most privileged children are sort of significantly ahead of those from disadvantaged. In this case, the share is in most countries around 20 or more %. When we look at gender, that's no longer clearly visible. In some countries, boys do better, in some countries, girls. So gender equity in math performance in school has pretty much been addressed. But then you see also that location matters. In most countries, being in a rural area is a drag on performance. In some countries, you look here at the United States or UK, or Germany, it's an advantage. Telling us basically that cities have more pull than push factors. But again, in most countries, being disconnected from large urban environments is also an educational disadvantage. So that's the next stage. After early years, you can see schooling compounding. And we've also seen relatively limited progress on this. Basically, where you see a green bar here, you can see that things have changed to the better between 2006 and 2015 when it comes to social disparities in math performance. When you see a red bar, you can see that things got worse. And you can say actually in most countries, there's not much of a difference and the positive and negative trends are almost evening out. So equity and educational opportunities in terms of cognitive results hasn't seen that much of an improvement in the last decade. And you can say there has been education mobility. Here you can see that 2 out of 3 adults from disadvantaged families actually attain a higher level of education than the parents did. But when you look at this in a little bit more detail, by type of degree. You can see for many that means a kind of vocational pathway, which then may lead to good employment outcomes, but typically is not associated with strong lifetime earnings. So you can see again how social disadvantage is now being transmitted even across generations. Most countries have significant challenges. First, to create a level playing field, giving children early in their lives an equitable access to high quality education and care. Then in schooling, making sure that they attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms and ensure that all students benefit from excellent teaching. And then in later in life, ensuring that pathways are not dependent on social background, because of course you want the best and brightest to get to the best places in education and not the wealthiest. Let's see how that impacts on the life chances. A lot of really interesting data on this. First of all, what you can see when you look towards the left side of the chart, these tend to be countries with larger earnings inequality. And what you can see, they are also with actually lower educational attainment. And what you can see is that they are also the countries with larger earnings inequalities. They take Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico. They still have relatively modest levels of education, which means that those who make it to the top, who get a tertiary qualification, get extraordinary benefits out of this. If you move towards the right, you can see that the earnings disparities by education attainment even out, which is what you expect, suggesting that one way to increase income inequality in education is to give more people better education. We've also looked at this by gender this year. You can see that men are more likely than women to not attain upper secondary education. So women are more successful in completing that level in most countries. Few countries is the other way around. And you can see in many countries sort of non-attainment of the baseline skills is now below 1 in 10, but you can see also there are many countries where we are talking sort of 15-18%, and some where these levels where it's the majority of young people in the age group 25 to 34 years who are not completing what we call the minimum entrance ticket to the kind of knowledge society in which we live. We also see some factors in the school. For example, when you look at those children who repeat a school year, that tend to be boys in most countries. The share of boys among repeaters in lower secondary education is higher than that of girls. So that's why inequality goes also in favor of women. And but then, once you look beyond initial education, you can see how gender and inactivity actually relate. What I'm showing you here is the difference between women and men in basically inactivity. So being not seeking work, being not in the labor force, or being unemployed. And you can see actually if you have a tertiary qualification, those gender differences get really small. You talk about 10% in most countries or less. If you have not completed high school, you can really see that the gap by inactivity, the gender gap, can become very significant. In a sense, men without high school degrees are more successful in finding jobs or at least seeking work, whereas for women that is a big barrier for access to the labor market. So once again, you can see gender gaps coming out. We also see that there is in most countries a quite significant pay gap. Here, basically, you see the women's earnings as a percentage of men's earning. We did this for full-time workers to take out the effect of part-time work, and you can see in most countries women with similar qualifications earn less than men, and that's to a large extent an effect of the kind of choices that you make when you enter tertiary education. Women often not choosing the kind of fields that are typically associated with higher earnings. We also see that then the consequence is that the women get a lower return on their investment because the degree typically costs you the same, whatever you study, But if you study in a field that doesn't sort of give a lot of earnings back, you end up with lower lifetime earnings. And you can see the bar here is shorter for women in not all, but most countries. They're shorter than that for men. Overall, however, you see that the private net financial returns are very strong for most people. Now, this is the average. In most countries, you can see basically it's a very worthwhile investment for people to get a better degree. And that holds both for men and women, but for women to a somewhat lesser degree. Let's move to migration and education, which is another facet of the picture of social kind of diversity. What we always see is that people with an immigrant background tend to be underrepresented among those who enter tertiary education. Here you can see basically the share of 15-year-olds who are first or second generation immigrants among new entrants to a bachelor's degree. Now that's basically the green dot, and in the population, that's the blue bar. And you can see in virtually every country, your chance to enter higher education is a lot lower if you have an immigrant background. We also see that even if you have a tertiary degree as an immigrant, that isn't always associated with a job. Here you can see employment rates of native, now that's the blue bar, and then people who arrived in the country by the age of 15, that's the diamond, and then those who arrived later, and there you can see sort of the numbers get quite a bit lower. So these are people who also have a tertiary degree, but it is not as much valued in the labor market as for people without an immigrant background. And that's covering sort of the entire age range of workers. We also see that reflected in the earnings. Here you can see the earnings of foreign-born workers as a percentage of earnings of native-born full-time workers. And again, you can see that in many cases, those numbers are well below the 100%. Showing you that, for example, people without high school degrees end up with a significantly lower earning if they are basically a foreign worker. For tertiary education, in many countries, or some countries, it goes the other way around. In many countries, we see less of a difference. So having a university degree does not, penalize you as much as a foreign worker. But if you don't, basically, you can see there's a quite significant kind of earnings gap over your working life. What can we do to improve equity? Well, first of all, there has already been a lot of improvement. The bars shows you the different, if you add up all the kind of degrees that are awarded in a country, short cycle tertiary degrees, these are typically more vocationally oriented programs, then the bachelor, master's or equivalent, doctor's or equivalent. And when I say equivalent, it means basically equivalent vocational qualification. And then in white, I have marked the figures for 2007. So you see a decade of progress here. And in some countries, actually, those kinds of attainment rates have virtually doubled. Now look at the Slovak Republic or the Czech Republic or Brazil or Indonesia. Very impressive progress in getting more people towards higher qualifications. But you also see that in some countries, their composition is dominated by first degrees, bachelors. You look at the UK here, whereas in other countries, vocational degrees or short cycle degrees are a very important source for the kind of attainment rates that you see. So different types of qualifications, but you add them up, you can see sort of an overall attainment rate. Some years ago when we published Education at a Glance and projected, there would be one day when, we would at least have half of the population obtaining tertiary qualification. People laughed at this and said, well, that's never going to happen. Today, we can actually see this in the data. In many of the countries here, it's actually over half of the population, 25 to 34-year-old, who now hold a tertiary qualification. Once again, you can drill that down by, and this is now secondary education, by type of program, general vocational programs. And you can see in some countries, you look at Slovenia or the Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, vocational degrees dominate, whereas in others like Korea or Canada, most young people below the age of 25 go for a academic program when they get a kind of high school level qualification. That was sort of a more positive picture on, lots of more people getting higher degrees, but not all of that actually is reflected in equality. And there are several important things that we added to the education at a glance this year. The first thing is we looked at the share of people who have a higher degree than what they need in their current work, and we call them overqualified. And similarly, we looked at the share of people who do not have the qualification they would need for their current job, and we would call them underqualified. And then there are the well-matched people who work in a job that has the same level of qualification. It could be a different type of study, but a similar kind of level. And what we do see in education at a glance, that the share of overqualified people is in some countries very significant. But what's interesting, when you look at the skills of people, you can see the skill levels here in green of people who are well matched to their job. So they've got a job that requires a degree. And you can see the bars are quite long. When you actually look at the skills of people, now we tested the numeracy skills of those people who work in a job, who have a tertiary qualification, but who work in a job that really only requires a high school degree or even less, you can see that the bars are a lot lower. Now, what does this mean? Well, take a country like France or Canada or the United Kingdom or England here. Now, what you can see, the gap is very significant. And in a country or a system like in England, you also have a lot of overqualified people. What this suggests to us is that those people probably got a degree, but they haven't acquired the skills that are congruent with the degree. So actually, when they get a job that is not needing an upper secondary education, probably they are quite well matched to the job in terms of the skills they have, but somehow they acquired a degree that is not, aligned with the skills they have. And in countries where there are high levels of tuition fees, those people have spent a lot of money acquiring a qualification that then has not resulted in the skill levels that they would need to get a job that matches those kind of qualification. So in one way, you can say we don't have actually compelling evidence from education at a glance that there is too much education around now, that people are overskilled. But we do have evidence, and you can see it in this chart, that we are not always very good in giving the right signals, that a lot of people get degrees or qualifications even if their skills are not really aligned with them. And that's important because that's a waste of money, that's a waste of time for people, and it suggests that like in schooling, we need to do a better job to align resources with the kind of quality, to have adequate value for money. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, I mentioned already when we talk about 3 to 5 year olds, there's been a lot of progress in most countries, and enrollment in many countries is now pretty close to universal, very different from the initial picture where we looked at the very youngest children. We also, and that's also once again reflected here, early childhood education and care and other registered services, you add them up in countries like Denmark, Israel, Norway, Korea, Colombia, you have at least 50% enrolled, and there are other countries where this is, just a couple of percentage points. So more work to be done for the very youngest children. And recent research actually should suggest that investment is particularly worthwhile. Particularly when you look at the kind of social emotional skills that are very important for the future of people. They are often acquired in the very early ages. In fact, later on, we often treat them as personality traits. Here you can see the number of children. It's basically reflecting the previous charts, a lot of progress in enrollment. You can see the number of teachers. In some countries, it increased faster. In other countries, the number of teachers didn't keep up with rising enrollments. So you can see student or child teacher ratios have evolved into different directions. In most countries, you can say actually systems try to reach higher levels of qualities, deploying more people per child, but it's not everywhere visible. Spending is always a very important part of education at a glance. Here you can see, first of all, overall levels of spending, adding public and private expenditure on institutions up, gives you sort of figures around or above 6% in countries like Norway, New Zealand, UK, Colombia, Chile, the US, and then gives you, on the other hand, countries where this is just, half of that. If you look at the Russian Federation. So volume of spending on education, quite variable. How do countries spend that money? Well, one way you can spend the money is on the infrastructure. We call it capital expenditure. And it varies a lot in school, but it varies even more in higher education. If you look at Greece and Colombia, it's 40–50% going into capital, buildings, infrastructure, and so on. If you look to Sweden, Finland, Belgium, Israel, it's 5% or less. So countries making very uneven investments in the kind of physical infrastructure, and most of that then goes in the skills. And let me talk about advanced skills for a moment. Here, the funding you can see often comes to a significant extent from private sources. You can see in the UK, Japan, Chile, US, and so on, Colombia, Korea, Australia. You can see it's actually New Zealand is the majority of funds that are generated through either households or expenditure from other private sources, whereas on the left side of the chart, most of the money comes from the public purse. Now, they're very different philosophies. You can roughly sort of divide countries into three groups. There are countries that have made higher education a sort of clear public good with everything funded through public expenditure, and then later those systems have a kind of graduate tax, basically steeply progressive income tax systems that then recuperate the money from the better paid, which are typically also the better educated people. Now, then you have another group of countries. You can look to Japan, Korea, Chile as examples. There's a high kind of share of private funding, but it's basically put on the shoulders of families, so they have to save for their children and then basically get access to higher education. In some of the cases, like in the US, there's a significant share of people that are getting public subsidies, but in Japan and Korea, still much lower. And then there's a third group of countries. You can look to the UK, to Australia, maybe New Zealand, where you have tuition. People have to pay for tuition, but governments give students income contingent loans or means-tested grants so that that takes out the risk from investment. So different philosophies underlying this. We can also see there have been changes in the relative shares of public and private money. On the left side, you can see countries where private investment increased. On the right side, where private sources have decreased. And then in green, the same for public sources. That was about sort of tertiary qualifications, advanced skills. Let's look at the foundations here. This is basically adding up primary and secondary education. You can see a country like Luxembourg spends a huge amount per student, and $200,000 in purchasing power parities. On average, it's a little bit less than 100,000, and then in some countries, like Mexico, it's about 25,000. So hugely varying amounts of money being invested per student. And it's not actually a great predictor for the quality of learning outcomes. There's some countries, like the Netherlands, that reach very good outcomes despite modest spending, and others who spend a lot who come out not so well. But of course, money is the necessary prerequisite. On this chart, you can see how that money is being spent. Basically, in blue, you have compensation of teachers. Then you have in red compensation for, for example, teaching assistants or other non-teaching staff. And then in green, other current expenditure. You can see some countries put virtually all of their money into people. That's like an example of Greece here. And then others that actually invest the significant shares in non-teaching current resources. Looking at spending in the early years, you can see that spending on early childhood education and care also varies hugely when you look at this as a percentage of GDP. And interestingly, also, we have seen very big changes in this. You look to Korea, for example. In 2005, it was, one of the lowest figures that we have on this chart, basically just after Ireland. In 2010, it reached, 0.3% almost, and today it's getting close to 0.6%, which is again pretty much around the OECD average. So some countries have hugely increased investments in the early years, but there's a lot of variability across countries. Student learning conditions. One of the things that we always look at is compulsory instruction time, and it's startling how hugely that varies across countries. You have countries like Australia, Denmark, Costa Rica, and so on, where the total number of compulsory instruction hours in primary and lower secondary education together is more than 10,000 hours, whereas there are other countries where you're talking about just around 6,000 hours. Time, again, also is not a great predictor for learning outcomes. There are some countries where students learn a lot in very little time, and other countries where students learn very little in a lot of time. But use it with a word of caution. But of course, again, time is a necessary prerequisite for better learning outcomes. Now, one of the most interesting analyses that we do every year is to see how all of those different factors interact and influence basically the cost, salary cost of teachers per student. And one way in which you can spend money is to pay teachers well. Where the bar goes up, basically countries spend more on teacher salaries than the average country. Where the bar goes down, teachers are not so well paid. Then you can spend your money on longer school days. Now, where the red bar goes up, school days are longer. When the red bar goes down, school days are shorter. Third way how you can spend money is teaching time. If you ask your teachers to spend a lot of their working time teaching, basically the blue bar goes up. The blue bar goes down. You save money when you ask your teachers to teach a lot. When the bar goes up, basically you want your teachers to do other things than teaching. And then the last part is the estimated class size. And you can see, for example, you look and then the total basically is the white dot. You can see, for example, when you compare, the Netherlands here, you can see what makes their system expensive, that they want to attract teachers, highly qualified teachers, so they spend a lot of salaries, but they pay for that with a large class size. So they have made a choice, they get a lot of money spent for teachers, also giving students more learning time, and they save money by A, having larger classes, and B, by asking teachers to teach many hours. In other countries, it's the reverse of that. Let's find a good example. Greece would be almost the mirror image of the Netherlands. Basically, what you can see here is in Greece, they don't ask their teachers to work so hard on teaching. Basically, that's driving costs up. And they have very small classes. That's also driving costs up. But even Greece can spend its own money only once. And you can see that means that they can't pay their teachers well, and their students don't have much time for learning. So you can see different choices being made in different countries. And of course, we can then relate that to the quality of learning achieved. That was about student learning conditions. We can do the same thing for teachers. We can look, first of all, on the salaries that teachers get, and you can see that varies a lot. The green dot is the starting salary, with the minimum qualifications. The red triangle is the salary at the end of your career. And you can see in some countries, teachers start with lower pay. Look at England here, for example, but then they can progress, and as they make advances, they get better pay. In other countries, look at Spain, teachers are quite paid well when they enter the profession, but there's not much to go. So different philosophies behind this. The other way to compare teacher salaries is to look at how do they fare when compared with other tertiary educated workers. And you can see in most countries that the value is below 1, so teachers are not so well paid as other people with university level qualifications, particularly in the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, United States, Italy. You can really see it's going to be very hard to attract, qualified tertiary workers into the teaching profession if you use money alone. Leadership. For the very first time, we have also indicators on the pay conditions of school principals. Now, once again, I show you here the salary range of teachers. And then in green, the minimum salary of school principals, and in red, the end of the salary scale for them. And you can say in some countries, if you are a school principal sort of at the high end of the salary scale, you get a great pay. Look at, for example, and much more than a teacher. Look at the Netherlands, look at England. But you can see also other countries where it pays very little to take on the significant added responsibility of a principal. Of course, that also relates to the work organization. In countries where school autonomy is very, very high, like the Netherlands or England, principals have to make many decisions. They have to, hire people, fire people, design the kind of learning environments, manage budgets, and so on. There, probably you need a different level of qualification than in countries that are more prescriptive, where principals are more administrative leaders. But huge difference in this. We also looked at, who makes decisions, and we can see there are a number of countries where actually the bulk of decisions are made at school levels. Look to the Netherlands. Most schools are kind of privately managed schools in a public system, and schools have to figure out virtually everything. From 100% of decisions, you can see 90 out of 100 decisions are made at school level. Czech Republic, England, Latvia, Flemish community, also very high. Then some decisions are made at local level, some at regional or sub-regional, and in some countries, the central state plays a very, very important role. Look at Portugal, look at Turkey, and so on. So it's we see that is very significant variation in the governance arrangements that systems have. It's very hard to say, to derive from this how this plays out in terms of quality. There's some indication that, some of the highest performing education systems give their schools more discretion, but you cannot make hard and fast rules out of this. The very last point I want to briefly touch upon is the internationalization of education. Now we look at higher education here. We have basically looked at the number of students that study in OECD countries. You're talking about 3.5 million, and then the number of students who study in non-OECD countries is another 1.5 million these days. Huge increase in internationalization. More people having access, more people, having high enough incomes to have their children studying in other countries, and that trend is sort of unabated. You can also look at who are the contributors to this. You can see, for example, here Luxembourg, Australia, New Zealand, Austria, UK are very significant destinations for international students. Now, this bar shows you the share of first-time international graduates by level of education, and then for bachelors, for masters, and also for doctoral or equivalent. So on the left side, you can see the principal student destinations. On the right side, you can see countries where student foreign intake is still a lot more limited. So that's really it, so that we can give you enough time for your questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Andreas. That was very interesting. Lots of food for thought. We have some questions from the audience, so I'll start with one that looks at the qualifications and mismatch or overqualification and skills. One question that has come in is, well, there's a sort of comment and then a question. Maybe another reason for lower levels of skills for overqualified might be that they have lost their skills due to working in a job that did not require the adequate qualification. Your interpretation was that they did not acquire skills through their qualification. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. There's always the possibility that we lose skills that we do not use. But you know, that's something I would still argue that the initial acquisition, and you can actually, you know, look at this when you look at this across age groups, you find a similar pattern also for the 25 to 34-year-old groups, where this argument of, you know, skill loss, even if relevant, is much harder to make. So I would still argue that probably a lot of those people have not acquired the kind of skills that their degree suggests.
Thank you. I have another question that relates to your slide number 19. And can you tell if it makes a difference if foreign workers hold a degree from the host country?
That is actually something I don't think we have captured in our indicators, unfortunately. We don't know whether the degree that those people have is acquired in the host country or in the country of origin.
Andreas, if I may add to that, the data does show, for example, the employment outcomes of those that arrived in the country before a certain age, so before the age of 15, and compares to those that arrived after that age. So while it's true that you do not see the actual results about where they got their degree from, you can make some inferences as to how well they've been able to integrate in their host country, depending on their age of arrival.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have another question about vocational education and training. Many are turning towards vocational education and training as a way to diversify the education programs available to students and better cater to students' different abilities and skills. However, vocational training in many countries has long suffered from negative public perceptions. What would you recommend to raise the attractiveness of these programs so they're not considered second best programs that can equally develop skills that are valuable to employers?
It's a very good point. You know, it's an issue of public perception. It's often also reflected in actual outcomes, whether it's employment or even more so earnings. So I think there is a real issue here. What can we do about it? I think it starts with making adequate investments. There are still countries where we spend a lot less per vocational student than per academic student, despite the fact that vocational education as such is actually more expensive because it's more resource intensive. So I think making sure that, you know, the quality of provision is high. You know, if you have a vocational institution, you would want that you are taught by the best people in their trade, not by the people who couldn't find a job in their trade. So actually investment there probably is an important part. We also know that the work-based component is key to success. What makes vocational education attractive is high quality work-based learning opportunities that allow you to work, you know, with real people in real contexts, with, you know, doing things that actually have a stake. Sort of having high quality work-based learning is a key element to make vocational education attractive. And then last but not least, ensuring that these are not dead ends. We often see that when you get a kind of vocational qualification, it's very hard to reconnect to advanced academic degrees. Universities are often not very good to, you know, recognize the skills that vocational graduates have acquired. So ensuring that systems remain open, that it's always possible to connect. You know, you become a car mechanic, later you want to become an engineer, and having those kinds of possibilities in the system is a key plus. Why do I say this? Because when you look at education systems that are very successful in offering a broad mix of academic and vocational qualifications and having also high participation rates, you talk about countries like Switzerland or Germany, where it's actually the preferred choice of the majority of young people going into vocational programs. Those are the characteristics of their approaches there. All of that being said, we still see, when you look at the long-term earnings returns, that investing in high levels of academic skills in the long run is typically associated with higher lifetime earnings. So I think we also must tell young people the truth. You know, with a vocational kind of pathway, it's easier to connect to the labor market. The integration into the world of work goes very smoothly. They offer an interesting alternative way of studying and learning. But in the long run, whether through selection or through quality of provision, or because people with a lower amount of transversal skills have a harder time to adjust to changing working conditions, there is a kind of drag on the overall lifetime earnings. And perhaps I should have said, high quality vocational education is also about sufficiently investing in the transversal component of skill development. So not only looking at, job specific knowledge and skills, but also in the kind of transversal skills that extend beyond a current job.
That was interesting. Thank you. We have another question about education programs for teachers. The question is, what type of teacher education program should be in place to ensure teachers are equipped to face the changing environments that they're confronted with, digitalization, immigration, and so on?
Yeah, the question already gives a big part of the answer. What we see increasingly is that just preparing teachers really well at the start of their career is only part of the answer. Most high-performing education systems also invest very significantly in the continued professional development of their teachers. Now, that means they give their teachers sufficient time to do other things than teaching. You go to Singapore, it's a 100-hour entitlement. Japan also very, very strong in lesson study and other ways of professional development. So high-quality professional development that is collaborative in nature is a big plus, often school-based. So that really is one big factor. But of course, initial teacher education will always matter. That's how you shape your kind of incoming cohort. Basically, what we see is that many countries have made initial teacher training quite selective. It's very hard to get into a program, but then once you're in, they invest significant resources into making sure that those who have successfully applied then also get an excellent education, an education that is not just academic, but also has in the initial period a significant share of clinical practice.
Thank you, that was interesting. We have another question about grade. We didn't talk about that. Okay, so we have another question, about the integration of immigrants. I'm sorry, I just got lost there. How can education help improve the integration of immigrants into their host countries?
Well, that's actually one of the most challenging issues for many countries these days. Immigration is on the rise, internationalization is on the rise. The one thing that we have seen is that early integration with significant additional support is the best answer to this. Where countries, Canada is a high performer on this, the Netherlands is doing quite well in Europe, where countries, or those countries with a long immigration history, United States, Australia, where countries basically give in a significant amount of initial support in the first years when immigrants come into the country, they can actually have a very large effect. Language is key. Now, where students do not speak the language of the host, they're going to have a hard time with integration. So focus on language, focus on additional support in an integrated fashion. Our research shows that dividing students into kind of special classes, special schools, when they have an immigrant background is not such a great idea. It's better, to learn with other students in regular classrooms and additional support, including the language of the host.
Thank you, Andreas. For another question we have about educational governance. What type of education governance encourages equitable outcomes in education?
That's one of the most intriguing questions because often, a higher degree of school autonomy is associated with a higher degree of inequality. If you leave schools more room for maneuver, you may get some schools are doing a great job, other schools less so, and sort of inequality will be on the rise. We actually find no such relationship in the data. You have countries, I mentioned before, the Flemish community in Belgium or the Netherlands, or, outside the OECD area, Hong Kong. They have an exceptionally high level of school autonomy and provide some of the most equitable learning opportunities. It's probably a combination of significant discretion at the front line, giving schools room to maneuver, to respond to different kind of contexts and learning situations, but combined with a strong regulatory framework that assures that, only good schools enter the market, and also incentive structures that align resources with needs. Many countries have introduced formula-based approaches to financing. We do not capture this in education at a glance because that's a kind of micro decision that is being made. But you do see that in many countries, significantly large amounts of resources go to students with the greater needs to make it intellectually and financially attractive for schools and teachers to cater for students with those special needs. Some countries pair high and low performing schools. Some countries build career pathways through different challenges. So there are different kind of ways of achieving this, but sort of having a sufficient degree of flexibility in the system and then combined with approaches that ensure overall coherence is probably the best recipe. A very kind of prescriptive, centralized approach to education is certainly no guarantee to a high degree of equity. In fact, some of the most centralized education systems where you would assume that every teacher is paid in the same way, every school is run in the same way, are actually the most inequitable ones.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more last question, and this is related to funding of education. If education resources that are funded by public or donor funds are made available free of charge, for example, open educational resources, could the cost of education be reduced, enabling countries to further increase the throughput of tertiary students?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are just at the very beginning here, and we're not just talking about, open resources that come top down into the systems. How much could be achieved if, every teacher knew what the most advanced teachers in the system know? If we had better systems to spread the good practices in one classroom. It's actually quite easy to get good practices into a school, into a classroom, but it's so much harder to get good practices out of the classroom into the system, to spread and share, the best ideas, the best education resources within systems. Knowledge mobilization is still a major challenge in education. Many teachers work very much in isolation in a classroom, in a school, and doing better on that, I think, would help a lot.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you again very much, Andreas, for your presentation and for answering all the questions that we have. And also I'd like to thank all our people who listened in. Just to remind people that this webinar is being recorded and will be available from our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/user/educontact in the next few days. So thank you all very much once again for attending, and I hope you found it interesting. Goodbye.
Thank you.